We would like now to turn to a more straightforwardly philosophical and sociological critique of the notions of radical freedom and individual authenticity, especially as they express themselves in this sort of popular philosophy and popular culture that characterizes the modern and contemporary era. I want to do that by looking at the important work written by Charles Taylor called The Ethics of Authenticity. I should make clear at the outset that Taylor's work is not some sort of point-by-point refutation or engagement with Sartre's existentialism or anything like that. Again, we're talking here about a sort of zeitgeist, kind of popular culture, set of presuppositions, which has come to dominate discussion and which has to some degree sort of crept into the background, forming a kind of template of our thoughts rather than being pushed out to the foreground as items that we might critically evaluate on their own. That's sort of what Taylor is attempting to do here, offer a kind of social criticism, a philosophical criticism of contemporary culture from within. And the way that he does it is he tries to identify what he calls three modern malaises, three malaises of modernity, three areas where he identifies us as having a kind of distinctively contemporary mindset that we've been bequeathed by way of the modern and postmodern philosophical progress that we have been tracking, and which he thinks are to some degree pernicious. These three areas are those he identifies as individualism, instrumental reason, by which he means the sort of exclusive monopoly of instrumental reason, and then finally what you might think of as a loss of civic mindedness or the civil virtues. So I want to discuss these one by one, sort of compare them against the ethos of an earlier age, beginning with the first, with individualism. What's Taylor mean by individualism? Well, as he designates it, individualism designates the idea that it's the human being, each individual human being, who must choose for themselves their own values and their own life projects. It stands in contrast to the notion that there is some sort of some set of external facts which could provide or determine the values or the role appropriate to a human person, irrespective of their choice. So, this sounds quite modern, quite contemporary, and it stands in contrast to a sort of pre-modern way of thinking. Remember that in bygone ages, the ancient, medieval, and even early modern era, there's a sort of idea that there was a natural order to things. There was an order within nature. Perhaps it was ordained by God and manifests itself in nature for that reason, or perhaps it was just the structure, the necessary structure of nature itself. But the idea was that there's a sort of chain or hierarchy of being. There are lower and higher forms of being. There are noble and less noble, more noble and less noble ways of being. And this sort of natural hierarchy is then reflected in, replicated in the social hierarchy. So, you find yourself with a particular nature, given the sort of creature you are, and you find yourself in a particular social role, which is supposed to be reflective of, imitative of the natural role that you occupy, being the sort of creature you are, and being possessing the gender that you do, or whatever it is. Okay, so this kind of framework, obviously, inasmuch as the order of nature is objective, inasmuch as the decrees of God and the ordination of God comes from without, this gives you a sort of determinate structure within which you can find yourself, plot yourself, within which your life has a determinate sort of preset meaning, and in which you can discover what your purpose or your role is supposed to be. Right, so given that there is some objective fact of the matter about what sort of creature you are, and that the sort of creature you are is objectively tied to some form of life that contributes to the flourishing of that sort of creature, constitutes the goal or the purpose of that sort of creature. And given the fact, too, that social hierarchies are supposed to be somehow replicative of the hierarchy in nature within which you find yourself, there is an externally set of conditions which tell you how you ought to act, what your meaning or purpose is, and what a good life or a virtuous life amounts to for a creature, a person such as yourself. Once you take all of that away, and you by the wayside goes the idea of a kind of objective, natural, or divine order of things, what you're left with then is a kind of human individualism which says, to the extent that I have meaning or purpose, it's got to be of my own making. And then this is paired together with a kind of classical liberal posture which says that the right sort of social structure is going to be one that allows for the sort of free play of the individual to decide for themselves how best they should pursue their own happiness, as long as it is consistent with the pursuit of happiness chosen by, the way of pursuing happiness chosen by fellow citizens and so forth. In addition to that, there is what Taylor identifies as a sort of monopoly of instrumental reason. What's he mean by that? Well, a couple things. Remember that according to David Hume, against the mainstream philosophical tradition, Hume argues that reason itself can't provide you with ultimate value. Reason itself, that is to say, can't tell you what your ultimate end or goal should be. Rather, reason can only be instrumental. It is used in order to tell you what the best means of achieving your ends or goals are, not to tell you what the goals themselves should be. That is something that is up to passion, is something up to something non-reasoned, some kind of arbitrary choice. It's not something reason can dictate for you. Now you put that together with the rise of utilitarian thinking in the 1800s and beyond, then what you get is a kind of instrumental reason brought to the ascendancy in the form especially of a kind of our collective attention being turned to questions of technology, scientific management, efficiency, the best, most quick and able ways of achieving our aims, rather than turning our attention to fundamental questions of what our aims and goals should be. Finally, there is the loss of political participation and civic mindedness. The idea here is this: to the extent that your personal relationships, your social relationships have meaning, it's only because they have the meaning that you have decided to attribute to them after you've freely entered into them, and only for as long as you've decided you should maintain those relationships, perhaps because they're meant to be furthering your own life agenda. When they stop furthering that agenda, you're free to retract yourself from them and so forth. So there's a kind of, along with this individualism, this instrumental reason monopoly, there's a kind of an inward turn where people look more and more inwardly away from others towards themselves and see themselves as more and more atomic or isolated from other people, rather than being in any sense sort of relationally defined. Okay. So Taylor sees all of these as being pernicious to human life. He offers a number of critiques on a number of fronts. I want to focus on one principally, and that is the critique that he gives of the notion of individualism as he defines it. So this by now is going to be a very familiar theme, right? The individual person is supposed to create from their own bootstraps, from the wellspring of their own being, is supposed to create for themselves what their own value, what their own meaning, what their own purpose in life is going to be. Remember that because reason can't adjudicate here, and there's no sort of external structure given by nature or God or both telling us that one form of life is objectively better or worse than another form of life. It becomes the case that there's no way sort of rationally to ground one ultimate form of life, the choice for one ultimate form of life or one set of values over another. And this in part explains, according to Taylor, why a lot of our moral debates seem so interminable and shrill. We recognize that on some fundamental level, everybody's choosing arbitrarily, and nobody really has a reasoned basis for the decisions that they make. Nevertheless, we're supposed to hang on to the idea that the individual human choice and the values expressed thereby are in a way sacrosanct. I mean, the cardinal sins, it seems, of our age have to do with not being tolerant of another person's choice of how they wish to live or what they wish to value, no matter what it happens to be, so long, of course, as it doesn't harm other people in their own arbitrarily selected form of life or pursuits or what have you. There's a philosophical problem here that Taylor points out. And he points it out by distinguishing between the value or meaningfulness or significance of the act of choosing a form of life and the value or significance or meaningfulness of the form of life chosen. So there's supposed to be this great value in freely choosing for yourself what your values and form of life are going to be. And this is so sacrosanct that it can't really legitimately, in a morally permissible way, be questioned by anyone else. At the same time, it's difficult to see how the life lived, the form of life chosen itself, can retain the kind of significance or meaning or value that we think that it does have. This is because once you think that the meaning or value or purpose of your life comes not from anything stable or objective or external or reasoned, but is simply a product of one's own non-reasoned, arbitrary act of choice, this undercuts the idea of authenticity that it is supposed to support. It's rather like, firing an arrow at the wall and then painting a target around it. When you do that, the very idea, the very concept of hitting a bullseye or of missing becomes a meaningless concept. And so too does part of the point of archery, you might think, right? So the idea here is, in this attempt to find the locus of value and meaning and purpose in an individual's free but non-reasoned and arbitrary choice of some form of life, this actually relegates the form of life chosen to a kind of insignificant or morally contentless result.